Always a bridesmaid, a stand-in, an unknown. For decades, movies shot in Toronto were decidedly not set in Toronto. The city played New York, Chicago, Washington, untold fictional locations, and so on. But recently, that's begun to change as TDOT seems to be coming into its own. Joining us now for more on the evolution of the city's presence on the big screen, Geoff Pevere. He's lead author of the anthology, Toronto on Film. Welcome.
Thank you, Neil.
Or should I say, welcome back.
Yeah.
You used to work here.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Years ago, I hosted a program called Film International, which was a weekly showcase for international films, which was, yes.
Is it weird to be back?
Yeah, it is kind of, well, it's not that weird. It's nice to be back.
Yeah.
It's nice to be back.
Well, it's good to have you talking
you.
about films. So 2016 was a big year for Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
The film and television production in Toronto surpassed $2 billion, which is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, yeah.
Why now? Why is this happening now?
It's happening now because it has an awful lot to do with sort of international monetary rates. It has an awful lot to do with the way that films tend to get made these days, which is that films are often made not in single countries by single industries, but by sort of alliances between a number of different countries, so that the mobility, the flexibility of crews, the ability to shoot wherever you can. Also, technology is more portable than it ever was. And also because after all of these years, Toronto now has one of the, I think, most efficient industrial basis of professional crews of any film production city in the world. So that's what makes it competitive. But the other thing to bear in mind is that while that's an incredible number, and that would be a very, very healthy part of this, whatever profits the city is managing to make, I would expect. The other thing is it's still a very whimsical business. For a business that can generate as much money as that, it's all, you know, for example, if there's a huge shift in the price, in the value of the American versus a Canadian dollar, that can affect things. Tax incentives, those kinds of things, and all of those things are subject to change by legislation and politics, and those can also have a very strong impact on the level of production in any city in the world, actually.
I'm also thinking, though, there must be something about the city that brings filmmakers here, isn't there?
Well, you know, for the longest time, as you were saying, Toronto was a strangely invisible city on screen. And it was an invisible city that seemed to defy logic because it's a city that's been steadily growing in population and shifting in terms of its cultural population over the years, all kinds of other things happening. You know, while we were, you know, erecting the tallest freestanding structure in the world and trying to get our own sort of baseball franchise, and our film festival started up, and all of those things were happening, and Toronto was really, really striving to be world-class and appearing to be world-class. The one area which seemed to be kind of conspicuously contradict that idea is that it would never seem to have much of a film industry or a recognizable star system, at least on the level of those cities that Toronto so often, I think, dreamed of being. London, Paris, New York, Los Angeles. And I think that, you know, part of the reason why, you know, for instance, when by the 1960s, when you did start to actually see feature films shot here and set in Toronto, many people that I've spoken to over the years talk about the experience of being startled at seeing their own streets on screen and named as their own streets on screen.
But why? Because I think if you live in New York City, if you see, you just expect to see, you know, the yellow cabs. You just expect the movie to take place in New York City. Why don't we have that kind of thing? I
think you know, there's first of all, you know, when you have to go all the way back to actually the first part of the 20th century, and because what was going on at that point is that various movie industries were consolidating. The major American industry had not yet migrated to Hollywood. It was still in New York. But also as it became very clear that this medium was going to be something that was going to be generating untold millions of dollars for people who were properly invested in it, what it meant was that there was a stronger and stronger incentive to defend those profits and defend that industry. And so what happened very quickly in Canada is that the business of theatrical exhibition of movies, Canadians owning theaters in Canada, even if not showing Canadian films, that became something which we lost. For the longest time, movie theaters in Canada were owned by American interests, often by American studio interests. So that meant that there was very little incentive to generate a movie industry, and it also meant that it was almost impossible to make films outside of Hollywood, for instance, and get them shown on screens when you didn't own any of the screens, and they were making all kinds of money from Hollywood movies.
Right, because our movies would probably not be shown south of the border.
They wouldn't be shown south of the border because we didn't have the stars, and we didn't have and even also, since we were discouraged from developing any kind of an industry, we weren't training people to make films properly. We weren't training people up to the level of other crews around the world.
We were just consumers.
We were just consumers, and we were huge consumers. This is the other funny thing about it, is that, you know, Toronto has long been known as one of the most avid movie attending cities in the world. All you have to do is look at the incredible success of the Toronto International Film Festival and to understand just how ready Toronto was to watch movies. But the fact is that in the absence of that industry, and also in the absence of an audience familiarity with looking at Canadian movies, that was another persistent problem. Canadians would often not want to go to Canadian movies because they had kind of internalized this idea that if they're Canadian, they can't be any good.
But are movies about the story, not, you know, I mean, I can watch a movie from India and I love it. I love Bollywood movies.
No.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my interest in movies was limited only to movies that reflected my experience, I would have watched maybe 3 films in my entire life, right? And even then, it would be a leap. And so, to me, no, it's all about that attraction to immersing oneself in experiences that aren't yours and that are fresh. But I think that what happens as a result of that is if you have if people aren't accustomed to looking at things that are unfamiliar to them, or if the things that are familiar to them set the standard of what they should be. So, for example, if your idea of what a good movie is a huge, successful Hollywood blockbuster type film with Tom Cruise in it, then it's very difficult for a Canadian film to compete with that. And that's also why so often Canadian films have basically been relegated to the status of foreign films in their own country, because they don't feel or look like Hollywood movies. And to bring this all back to Toronto, what it means is that you had a huge audience that loved going to movies, but they were unaccustomed to watching Canadian movies, and there was very little demand for Canadian movies. And so when we started making films with any regularity in Canada, there had to be basically a protected institutional environment created that was apart from the commercial arena so that we could make our films. And we did. But we needed things like the NFB and the CBC to provide the only context in which...
The NFB is the National Film Board?
National Film Board of Canada, yeah. I mean, the legacy of the National Film Board of Canada in terms of its creation of the first generations of Canadian filmmakers, and what happened to those filmmakers when they went out to make their own films outside of the NFB is really important to the history of film in Toronto, but generally critical to the understanding the history of film in Canada. Yeah.
Why is NFB so important?
The NFB was created in 1939, and it was an effort that was made in order to try and create a sense of community in this widely, insanely dispersed mass and small populated mass of land called Canada. The NFB was tasked with the job of what it was called interpreting Canada to Canadians. And so when the NFB, and again, the NFB was not required to compete commercially with Hollywood movies, the NFB began to work in styles that were outside of the dramatic feature film form. The NFB generated an incredible legacy in documentary, also some drama.
And even short clips, right? Short movies?
Short clips, yeah, short films, animated films, but also it was strongly also something which was prone to films that tried to articulate problems that Canadians were facing as well. So there was also this kind of almost like an advocate agenda in the NFB's history, and also you could say in its DNA. But the fact is that none of this stuff would have happened if the NFB hadn't been able to operate as basically a kind of a protected studio, a government-protected studio environment. That's come up for a lot of criticism over the years, especially as anything involving anything involving state subsidies has got this kind of like taint to it these days. The fact is that without that, we wouldn't have had the NFB, and we wouldn't have had the first generation of Canadian filmmakers.
And all the documentation of Canadian history.
Exactly, yeah.
I want to show you a clip of one movie that was shot, one of the earliest movies shot in Toronto, and it was called Going Down the Road, and get your reaction after. This movie came out in 1970. What was the reaction like when it came out?
The reaction was it's interesting to go back to it because almost universally, but there was a huge amount of reaction that suggested that this was a breakthrough and a revelation, and that was largely because it was for many people the very first made in Canada Canadian film they had seen. Certainly, one of the things I heard over and over again too was what it was like to watch that movie in a movie theater on Yonge Street, and then to step out and see the same environment that you were looking at on screen, and how incredible that was. But Going Down the Road was also a film that, on not on a huge level, but certainly on a compelling level, was a hit film. It played to very, very positive critical response in many other countries around the world. It was more or less widely distributed, and ultimately, it's a very low-key, very hugely documentary-influenced examination of the very difficult lives of two Maritimers who come to Toronto seeking work. They're leaving an environment where the fisheries are being closed, unemployment is on the rise, so they head to Toronto, and what you see is a kind of a weird it's a kind of a perversely dark reversal of the Wizard of Oz story. When they get to the Emerald City, the city doesn't want them, and none of their dreams kind of pan out. But what's very interesting about that is the film uses a documentary style that is very Canadian in its traditions. The film deals with a very, very specifically Canadian issue, and it was an issue at the time, was the increasing amount of unemployed people who were coming to the city and staying unemployed. And that was a big issue too at the time. I think probably still is to a certain extent. And I think also the reflection of Toronto playing Toronto, all those things came together and made that film look for a few minutes like it was going to be the future of Canadian movies.
And this movie had a big impact on you because you wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I wrote the book largely because I knew I always felt that the legacy of the film was underappreciated, and this is a larger issue, which is that often it is it's difficult to fully understand and appreciate things that have an impact culturally in a country if the country doesn't have a very good memory for these things. And Canada, unfortunately, has not ever really had a very good memory for it, especially what I would call its pop cultural history, movies, television, and that kind of stuff. And so the thing that was interesting to me was that I felt I wanted to document what the film meant to people when it opened, what the circumstances were of its production, because those were also very unique and very, very, very typical of Canada too. It began as an idea for a documentary, but the program that it was going to be aired on CBC originally was canceled. So, but the guy who was the executive producer of that department said to the young director, Donald Shabib, this is still a really good idea. You should go out and maybe consider making an entire feature film out of it. And so here you have a guy he goes out into Toronto, and he's making this first feature of his, and he's making it. His experience has been almost exclusively documentary. And but all of these things meant that he had almost no budget whatsoever, and he was working with actors who were all quite good, but many of whom had never been on screen before. And so all of this gave the film a texture, not just of, I say, authenticity and reality, but it also gave the film a kind of a tone. It was a tone that was unlike anything I think people had seen, certainly in a Hollywood movie before. The closest that they'd probably seen would be in certain French films or certain British kitchen sink
like
movies.
Before Sunset, maybe.
Well, that kind of, anything, yeah, that has that kind of like sort of improvised on the street level to it, or and then that deals with people who otherwise we might not even otherwise sort of look at. So for all those reasons, the movie had a big impact at the time.
We're running out of time.
Yeah.
So interesting. I want to move from a movie with a very low budget to a movie with a big budget, and this was the remake of The Hulk. And here's a clip. Now, I see Zanzibar.
Yeah, I know.
And I also think I saw Sam the Record Man. There it is.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden the Apollo.
Yeah.
Isn't the Apollo Theater in New York City?
Yeah, I guess we can figure that maybe the Hulk ran all the way from Toronto to New York because he was really angry. He's got superpowers, but yeah, I know.
Why do that? Why not just say it's Toronto? Why all of a sudden put in like an iconic symbol of American culture?
Well, I mean, it's a baffling thing. But it's a great spectator sport if you live here. It's always been a great
spot the Toronto.
Yeah, exactly. Spot. Look at the way that cameras are sometimes just struggling not to get the CN Tower in the background. But you see, in that case, yeah, that's where it becomes kind of absurd. It's like I mean, because that's a movie you would think that would be at least making an attempt to more carefully disguised. But again, what happened is that Toronto managed to build up through the years of television production, and then later on, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a tax incentive created for Canadian filmmakers. For Canadian films to be made largely as a result of tax incentives, and so suddenly there were all kinds of films being made in Toronto. Although many of those films were never released, and none seem to be fondly remembered, or few seem to be fondly remembered, the fact is it finally provided the circumstances in which we began to create a huge basis of experienced crew members. And so even though the context itself was maybe not the noblest in Canadian film production history, the fact was it ultimately allowed Toronto to make a huge step towards being a competitive industrial center for the production of films.
I have another clip for you, and let's take a look at the F Word, shot in Toronto.
So is Ben settling in okay?
There you go.
Yeah, he's great. He's doing great. He's having a great time.
Are you having a great time?
Not really. I'm having kind of a crappy time, actually.
Sorry.
Yep. This, right now, this is the high point of my social calendar.
Oh, that is sad.
Now, obviously, that is Toronto. We see the CN Tower, and that was done at Riverdale Park.
Yeah.
How big was this movie when it came out?
I think the movie did quite well, actually, and I think the fact is that it was also something that was, and it may have been the presence of Harry Potter probably had something to do with it, but I think that the film also was part of what you're seeing, which are more of Scott Pilgrim versus the World is another good example of that, which is a movie that has no shame about being set in Toronto, and has no kind of second thoughts about whether or not interesting things or interesting people.
It feels like Toronto's another character.
Well, yeah, it also feels like it's just the whole question is like, why wouldn't it be set here, right? And you don't ask that question about New York or San Francisco movies. You don't go, why are they set? What are you doing in that city?
I want a different city.
What are you doing in that? Yeah, Steve McQueen. Why are you driving around that car in San Francisco? All the roads are bumpy. Why don't you go somewhere else? But that was a question that seemed to be asked largely before. And I think what you've seen is a number of films, a number of filmmakers who didn't grow up with the same kind of Canadian cultural baggage, didn't grow up with the same kind of notion of perhaps, that it couldn't be any good if it's Canadian, and also didn't grow up with the same tradition of the NFB and the CBC, and who also grew up in a city where there was it was a more invigorating production center. They had a very successful film festival, and you just, I think, without asking, second guessing in any way, you started thinking about creating stories that were set in Toronto. So I think what we've seen now in the last, especially in the last 15 to 20 years, is more films that are sort of unembarrassingly set in Toronto. And as a result of that, you begin to see, it's kind of still kind of nice to me to see the city be allowed to relax and play itself.
We've spent a lot of time talking about film,
Yeah.
but television also plays a big part in this.
Yes, yes.
What's television's role in Toronto film production?
Well, I mean, the fact is that the first images of Toronto that were seen by any sort of significant number of people were images that were generated for television. You know, by the late 1950s and certainly by the mid 1960s, the CBC was getting involved in dramatic production, and a couple of those television series were actually set in Toronto. So it's a huge history. But the other thing is that television is now, the fact is more and more, there's probably as many television series which are shot and even set in Toronto now as there are films. And so, but that is also because the crossover in terms of whether it's production experience, but also television also represents, I think, an easier way for Canadian filmmakers to find audiences. It's still really difficult to get our movies into movie theaters. In fact, if anything, it's more difficult than ever before. And the reason for that is that we don't make superhero movies, right? We don't make, you know,
they're shot here.
They're exactly, they sure, as we saw, they're certainly, you know, they're shot here. But the fact is that we don't make those kinds of films that tend to be
the money generators.
Yeah, they're not money generators, and so but television is a really important part of the history in terms of it was being the first there to kind of give us an idea of a moving picture reflection of our city, but also to provide all that experience and to an audience. And I think it was probably helpful a lot of people to begin to ask the question that otherwise might not have occurred to them, which is like, why don't we see more movies set here in Toronto?
Yeah. So should a movie or a television show depict the city as it is, or would it as it would like to be seen?
That's a really good question, because you know, you look at something like Going Down the Road. Going Down the Road, you know, was actually trying to be very, very kind of authentic and clear-eyed about its depiction of Toronto from the perspective of these two guys, and it was a harsh picture of the city. After that, it's really kind of interesting. If you look at certain filmmakers, Toronto filmmakers, David Cronenberg is a great example of this. Later on, I think Adam McGuire is another example of this. You look at Denis Villeneuve's Enemy that was made here a few years ago. Toronto, it's very interesting, is very often depicted as a great place to be if you are completely alienated and disconnected from society. It's often very cold. It's depicted as really cold and empty and unforgiving, and that's really kind of interesting because some people have said, well, why is the city depicted so negatively? And I would just say that that's not the question. The question isn't why is the city depicted so negatively. It is why are so many filmmakers who live in this city prone to, attracted to stories like that? And I just think there's something about that. There's a certain hesitance, there's a certain suspicion, wariness in Canadian films, which I think is part of what makes them distinctive. You know, there's always a sort of a dread that what you're looking at any time might be taken away from you, and I think that's a good Canadian sort of reality check. But I also think, you know, you talked about, you know, the F Word and the Scott Pilgrim versus the World. These are films. I think Sarah Polley's. I keep wanting to say Last Waltz, and it wasn't Last Waltz, and I apologize.
Oh, the one with the Michelle Williams.
Yes.
And yeah, I know.
Yeah. Adam McGuire's Chloe is another one too, which just depicts.
Take This Waltz? Was it
Take This Waltz?
Oh,
thank you. Thank you. And Adam McGuire's Chloe were also films that were important in trying to create a kind of almost a romantic veneer around the city. And I think that the fact is the city should be there and be offered for any interpretation you want to, which is I want to depict the reality of the city, or maybe I want to make a comment on things that I think are wrong in the world, and I'm gonna basically skew the city so that it reflects that particular agenda that I've got, which is fine too. Or it's no, I want to depict Toronto as romantic as Paris. The fact is, none of those things are right or wrong, but a city is not, I think, a healthy one in terms of its own cinematic identity, if you think that's important, unless you can interpret it any way you want. I mean, a city is often it's an idea, it's a projection, it's an ideal, it's a dream. And the fact is that for the longest time, Toronto wasn't even allowed to dream about itself. It wasn't even allowed to do that. Now that it's doing it, it should be allowed to do it in any way that it wants.
And do you see a time when other cities dress up as Toronto in film productions?
I'd love to see that. Yes, I would love to see somebody trying to disguise, you know, the Notre Dame in Paris as something, as the Eden Center in Toronto, that kind of thing.
Is that a sign that you've made it?
We will really, yes, we will have really made it. I mean, the closest I can think of is, and it was only for budget, is that there's a great 50s Western called Pony Soldier, which is about the Northwest Mounted Police, and they're attempting to very kind of generously monitor any kind of misbehaving native population. But the interesting thing about the movie is that it's so clearly shot in Arizona and near Monument Valley, because there ain't any landscape in Canada that looks like that stretches that far and has no trees whatsoever in it. That's the closest thing. But yes, we would really know that we had made it if we were looking at a movie that was trying to be Toronto.
Maybe a Wolverine movie,
Never,
or a Superman
movie,
or Wonder Woman Part 2. You never know.
Yeah, no, and the thing is, you know, but that's an important point, Nam, is you're saying at this point it seems possible. 10, 15 years ago, I would have gone, no, I can't imagine that. Now I can.
It's been so much fun talking movies
Likewise.
and television.
Likewise.
It's nice to see you, Geoff.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.